Welcome. This is presentation number 2 in our series Rereading the Fourth Gospel. The Fourth Gospel has the story of Jesus the Revealer. And we want to broaden our scope on how this piece of writing came into existence. And so our title today is Mentor and Disciples, Memory and Manuscript. So let's review a couple of things from our previous presentation, the first presentation. At the end of the fourth gospel, we have brought to view a revealer, a beloved disciple, and a community. We see in the ending here, this is from the very last verse, there are also many other things that Jesus did. What Jesus did, what Jesus said, is the topic of the book. That's how it is. But there is also, we saw, a beloved disciple in the story. 5 times mentioned as the beloved disciple, present with Jesus at crucial moments, and he is the one to whom we owe the story, according to the ending of the book. And so he is the one. We need to know a little about him too. And then there is a community. The rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die, and that intrigued us. And so we put a timeline here. We put a timeline where you have first-hand acquaintance with the story. Memory from the beginning, memory of the Last Supper, the cross and the resurrection, memory of the meeting by the lake, and a new commission. All of this happening in the span of about 3 years. And then we have a bit of an unknown. So we don't know exactly here, and yes, there are other ways of reconstructing the story here, but I tend to see it as this verse that says that the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die, the beloved disciple, suggests that we are at the end. We are some years removed from the original story of Jesus when this is put into its final form, final writing. So this information here, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, this led us to conclude like this, that the story in the fourth gospel is the story of what Jesus said and did as told by the beloved disciple at the time when the beloved disciple is about to die or has died. And he was a person who was with Jesus from the beginning, and thus a first-hand witness, an eyewitness, to the story remembered and written many years later. So the last 2 points here, exactly when this took place, when the writing began or when it was written, we cannot settle that with certainty, but we have an eyewitness, we have the claim of an eyewitness account. That's what we can take away from it. Now, I owe some of these ideas to one of my mentors. His name is Richard Bauckham, and he was a professor at the University of St. Andrews when I was there for doctoral studies. Yes, I did go there because I wanted to be mentored by Richard Bauckham, mostly for his work on the book of Revelation, which is also substantial. Since then, he has also done, or at the time I was there, he was busy working on the Gospel of John. And I consider Richard Bauckham the finest scholar of the New Testament in the UK, and one of the finest in the English-speaking world of our time. So here are some of his books relevant to our topic here on how the Gospels came into existence. The Gospels for all Christians. what was the implied audience? Not only Christians maybe, but not just Gospels written for select communities. It's for everyone. And then Jesus and the eyewitnesses, the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. And here one about the testimony of the beloved disciple, that's the Gospel of John, fourth Gospel. And here another one more recent, Gospel of Glory, major themes in Johannine theology, also a book on the fourth Gospel. So these are major contributions, and I have no doubt that they will be lasting contributions that will shape our understanding of the subject. Yes, there has been a pushback by some scholars, but still the impact of these books will be significant. So here is a statement from close to the ending of Baucham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. We have argued that the Gospels put us in close touch with the eyewitnesses of the history of Jesus. The Gospel writers, in their different ways, present their Gospels as based on and incorporating the testimony of the eyewitnesses. That's true for all of them. And then to our book. In one case, we have argued an eyewitness has authored his own gospel, and it is notable that precisely this gospel, John's, is the one that incorporates the most extensive reflection on the significance of the eyewitness testimony by the beloved disciple who is present there and there and there, and to whom the gospel is attributed. So that we want to look at some aspects of that argument. Now, Baucham acknowledges in his work, the work of a Swedish Lutheran scholar, Samuel Björskog, who still, I think, is teaching at the University of Lund in Sweden, and whose book here has been influential, Story as History, History as Story. Story, here you could also use the word testimony, personal testimony, someone's personal story, or someone's personal experience even. And this is also then a subtitle on how the Gospels came into existence. And here are some points relevant to our subject. So here we read in the Gospel of John, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we should read this as testimony aspiring to be accepted as history. Yes, it's someone's experience, but it happened. And if it happened, the claim is then it counts as history. And then testimony, especially eyewitness testimony, had special status in ancient historiography. Historiography is a term for how you write history, what criteria you have for writing good history. And in the ancient world, they were not afraid of the personal testimony. In fact, the personal testimony counted as highly valuable history or source for history. And then we too, like the ancients, recognize the value of testimony, and I will show how in just a minute. So this is not something that has become completely obsolete, even though our criteria for what counts as what should I say, critical history have changed somewhat. So here is the last one. Certain aspects of history are only accessible to us because we have a person's testimony. There's some things that simply are not knowable if we did not have that. And so in the last chapter in Baucham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he actually goes to contemporary examples of how testimony functions in our recent history, and will use witnesses from the Holocaust. And I have thought the same, actually somewhat independently of Bauckham. So this, in some ways, it broadens the legitimacy of the conviction I hold, and in some ways it adds to it, certainly adds to it. So one of his examples is Elie Wiesel, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996, and I think I was present in Oslo when he was awarded the prize. And then this book, that was his first book, the personal account of his experience in the Holocaust as a victim. So this book, Night, that is also one of the first Holocaust accounts I read, and many have read it. In the version I have, there is a foreword by the French writer François Mauriac. François Mauriac won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1952. So these are eventually two Nobel laureates, you might say. So here Mauriac looks at this Jewish Israeli journalist, which is what Wiesel was at the time when they met, and he saw a fragile person, one with a face that seemed to radiate the experience of suffering. So they talked about the deportations of the Jews and the children that went on the trains. And this is Mauriac speaking. And when I said with a sigh, how often I've thought about those children, he replied, I was one of them. And that, of course, transforms the whole conversation, because now he is an eyewitness. Now he can testify of that experience from within that experience. And aren't you happy that someone can do that for us? And aren't we, must we not concede that unless we had such witnesses, there would be something very important we would not know? Here is what we get to know. This is in Wiesel's own words. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in the camp. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the faces of the little faces of the children. Never shall I forget those flames. From someone who saw it up close and personal. And yes, these were sequestered spaces that many people wouldn't see and wouldn't know. Intentionally, of course, we were excluded. So here is one eyewitness testimony that we today, we have no problems accepting this as history, and in fact as extremely invaluable history or valuable history. So here is another one. These are the now collected works of Primo Levi. Primo Levi is an Italian Jew, educated as an industrial chemist and living and working in the city of Turin in Italy. And he was captured in 1944 and survived and came back to Turin and resumed his work as an industrial chemist in that city. This is what he writes in his first book. Nevertheless, those memories burned so intensely inside me that I felt compelled to write as soon as I returned to Italy. And within a few months I wrote, If This Is a Man. This book also has the title Survival in Auschwitz, which is not a good title. I wrote If This Is a Man. The manuscript was turned down by a number of publishers. It was accepted in 1947 by a small publisher who printed only 2,500 copies and then folded. So the book was written because he felt the need to do it. His experience needed to be told, or at least he sensed that he needed to tell it. Well, the market for it wasn't great. In 1958, another publisher picked up the book and republished it. And immediately it was like an earthquake in literature in Italy. It sold 500,000 copies in just about no time. And yes, the books of Primo Levi are today recognized as some of the most valuable accounts, most unembellished, if you may put it that way, accounts. But they are in the category of testimony. They are in the category of personal experience. And when I was on a Holocaust trip in April of 2019, I did go to Turin. I went to his apartment. I wanted to see it. And I actually rang the doorbell and spoke to his grandchildren. And I saw in the streets a poster that still today in Turin, in Torino, in Italy, they perform the book, If This Is a Man, because it was actually in the theaters at the time. So while the initial reception here was not great, today it still resonates. This is so important that I want to give a couple more examples. This is Victor Klemperer. He was a teacher of languages of French literature at the Technical University in Dresden in Germany when Hitler came to power. And in 1933, that is exactly when Hitler came to power, he started keeping a diary. It was published actually not till the 90s in Germany. And it immediately created a sensation. But notice the title, I Will Bear Witness, 1933 to 1941. Here is one from 1942 to 1945, and there is yet another one that covers the time until his death in 1960. And yes, I have gone to his house. There is his house overlooking Dresden. There is the grave memorial, the gravestone for his wife, Eva, who was not Jewish. Du bist mir immer gegangen voran, O Herz, bei Tag und Nacht. You have always gone ahead of me. This is a heartfelt confession of his love for his wife. You have always gone ahead of me by day and by night. It's very moving, to say the least. But it's eyewitness. It's eyewitness testimony. I shall go on writing. This is my heroism. I shall bear witness. Precise witness. And we would be much poorer if not for these witnesses. That those witnesses also count as history told to us from within and told to us about exceptional events. I have a few more, because these are my friends. These authors are mentors to me also. And I am not using this opportunistically to make a point about the Gospel of John. My interest in these witnesses is also primary and has no other agenda than that I think it is worth listening to them. But this is Saul Friedlander, who also is a Holocaust survivor who was separated from his parents. He was sent to a French family, French Catholic family, and his parents tried to flee to Switzerland. It didn't succeed, and they were exterminated at Auschwitz. So he became a historian and has taught at UCLA. And his two books on the on the Holocaust, the years of persecution and the years of extermination, are, in my view, the most amazing, the most important, the best books written on the subject. So these are written as history, written according to the rules of historical writing today. But he has also written a personal account. This is Saul Friedlander's book, When Memory Comes, his own story, written when he was a young man newly arrived in Israel, when memory comes. And of these books, which one is more history? One is history and one is testimony, but both are history. And many people will say, or many people will find it easier maybe to read his book When Memory Comes. There is another one, a sequel to it, Where Memory Leads. And these are testimonies as history. And one more. This is Etihillism, whose diaries have been discovered very recently. Diaries are also a form of testimony. Diaries as eyewitness testimony. She is a Dutch Jew and living in Amsterdam. And she started writing her diaries in 1941, and I have the collected works. I have been to an international conference on the diaries of Etihillism. That's how valuable people think it is. And we need to move forward here, but here is a postcard that was thrown from the train. The date on the postcard is September 15 in 1943. And this is the front of the postcard. It was written to Christine Van Noten, one of her friends. And this is the back side of the postcard. So this is her own handwriting. And this is what we will read on the postcard. And here you can see another better picture of Etihillism, who at that time was 29 years old. I am sitting on my rucksack in the middle of a full freight car. Father, mother, and Misha, her brother, are a few cars away. In the end, the departure came without warning. She was an inmate at the camp at Westerbork in Holland. On sudden special order from The Hague, we left the camp singing, father and mother calmly, Misha too. We shall be traveling for 3 days. That's how long it takes to get from Amsterdam to Auschwitz. Goodbye for now, from the four of us. She wrote this on September 7, 1943, and she perished on November 29, 1943, at Auschwitz. So, these are personal testimonies of uniquely unique events. And we value them. We don't question them. We don't think that these people are making things up. The personal testimony has weight, and in some ways weight more than anything. And so with the Gospels. Here, back to Richard Bauckham, who also do not use these, who is also not using these examples opportunistically. Reading the Gospels as eyewitness testimony differs therefore from attempts at historical reconstruction behind the text. It takes the Gospel seriously as they are. It acknowledges the uniqueness of what we can know only in this testimonial form. It honors the form of historiography they are. From a historiographic perspective, radical suspicion of testimony is a kind of epistemological suicide. So you're not going to accept personal testimony because it is somehow suspect. Well, you know, if you do that, you saw off the branch on which we are sitting, what he calls epistemological suicide. Epistemology is the science of what we know. There will be something important we won't know. We want to fortify this perspective of the value of testimony, to fortify it with another aspect that is actually more prominent in the other Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, than in the Gospel of John. Memory fortified with the notion of mentor and disciple that you find in these books. Jesus was a teacher who ran a training program. And transmission of the story, transmission of his story, is part of the story inside these books, And it is not an accidental feature. That is to say, you learn in these stories that the story is going to be told. Let's read a few texts from the Synoptics. Here is from the Gospel of Mark, the first chapter, right away from the beginning. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired man and followed him. So here Jesus is recruiting disciples, and we have an illustration of that, a sort of composite of how this could have happened. Of course, this is not Sea of Galilee, it is some European lake, but imagination has its limits. You can't do everything. And we have the same story here in Matthew. Let's read it. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. It's almost exactly like you find it in the Gospel of Mark, and 90% of Mark is reproduced in the Gospel of Matthew. So that's an easy one. Here is what it means. Jesus called disciples from the very beginning. The first disciples are fishermen. Among the first disciples, 4 are named: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So the story of how these disciples came into being is somewhat different in John. We saw that in Matthew and Mark it's very, very similar. But John, he has a little different take on it. So we have a fish lesson here at the beginning in the Synoptics. Here I read that in the Gospel of Luke. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." He's the boss. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. That's in Luke chapter 5. Now we have a fish lesson at the end. This is in the Gospel of John. And here we read, "Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, 'Children, you have no fish, have you?' They answered him, 'No.' He said to them, 'Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some.' So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish." Now, these are two fish stories. One happens in the Synoptics at the beginning, at the calling of the disciples. This one happens at the very end, in the last chapter in the Gospel of John. And we have not in the Gospel of John even been told that they had anything to do with fishing, you know. But there seems to be some awareness of the Synoptics in the Gospel of John. That's our point. But we have a reason to mention these differences. So, how did he recruit disciples in John? Let's just look at that. The next day, John, now we are in chapter 1 in the Gospel of John. The next day, John, that's John the Baptist, was standing with 2 of his disciples. I have underlined that. He was standing with 2 of his disciples. And as he watched Jesus walk by, he exclaimed, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." The 2 disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. When Jesus turned and saw them following, he said to them, "What are you looking for?" They said to him, Rabbi, which is translated means teacher, where are you staying? He said to them, come and see. They came and saw where he was staying, and they remained with him that day. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We're going to say more about that when we get to that topic in our series. But here we see some differences, and what are they? So we have our picture here. This is John the Baptist, and he is preaching and making an impact prior to the arrival of Jesus in our story. But so adding this up, we have relationship of mentor and disciple in John. We have disciples, we have mentees, trainees, students, apprentices. We have that, disciples, but the disciples here have first been the disciples of John the Baptist. And there is no mention of fishermen until the end in the Gospel of John. And in the Synoptics, Jesus recruits disciples. In John, it almost looks like the disciples are, seeking out a mentor. Is it a mentor seeking disciples or disciples seeking a mentor? You have that ambiguity. And then we have named the disciples in John: Andrew, Peter, Philip, and Nathaniel. So slightly different. But in both, we have the notion of a mentor. And in both, we have the notion of disciples, people who are learning from a mentor. And that is something that strengthens the witness we are looking at here. Further along in this process, in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we have a further winnowing, a further selection of the trainees that will follow Jesus. He went up the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles. And here is what he intended for them: to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the message, and to have authority to cast out demons. So here is a selection. And in one of these accounts, he spends the whole night in prayer. And then he makes the selection. So you have to think, he has to be, should I take him? Should I take him? He has a pool that is bigger than the number he ends up with. There could have been a bigger number, but he appointed 12, it says here, and there is a selection of trainees here from this larger pool. So again, there is intention, there is execution. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. Now there is practice. Now they're going to do something and try out the mission, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. And here in Luke, Jesus called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. So this is deliberate. There is a training program here, and we can take some elements away from it. So Jesus recruited disciples. From a large pool of potential trainees, he selected 12 for special training. His selection criteria, what were they? Well, you have to infer that. He doesn't say. Was it that they had ability? Probably so. Was it that they had teach ability? That they were teachable? Probably so. That's an even better one. That you are in a learning mode. You are accessible, as it were. And his training program, what was it? Because here they are becoming his students, to be with him 24/7, it almost looks like. And then whether in the Synoptic Witness or in John, we see a purpose at work. This is not something that happens haphazardly. It happens by intention. And this leads us to another book, another insight, another contributor to how things were working in antiquity. This is a book by another Swedish scholar, Birger Gerhardsson, who wrote a book called Memory and Manuscript that has sort of persisted as an influential voice, tradition and transmission in early Christianity. There are flaws in his book because he draws on later rabbinic tradition more than maybe he should have, but these are elements of mentoring in antiquity. You do memorizing. Someone says something, you memorize it. It's an oral culture where memory counts for more than just writing. So you have memorization, you have learning and understanding, text and commentary. You have a tendency to be succinct when you can't just remember everything. You have to remember the most important things. You avoid wordiness and vacuity. And you make use of didactic and poetic devices to facilitate memory. You have repetition. That is also the mother of learning. You have recitation. You go out and you share it. And you see if you can master it, if you can do it well. And you have also comprehension, a struggle against lifeless or unimportant knowledge. So here we are. We have in the Gospel of John the claim of eyewitness testimony. And we have in the Synoptics the claim of a school, a training program, all aim to facilitate mastery and to make the story of Jesus' life and teachings accessible to future generations, to those who do not experience the story firsthand. So we have intention at work. It is not all that different from what happens in medical training for the last more than 100 years due to the influence of William Osler, who in the end at Johns Hopkins University in the US ran a training program that we call residency training. Why do you call it residency training? Because the trainees are living in the hospital. They reside in their training environment at the hospital. Residents, they are not unlike the training, and this is not unlike the training envisioned in the 19th century by Sir William Osler, the father of modern medicine, where you learn, and we had this when I was in medical training, that you learn to do something, you see it done, and then you do it yourself, and then you teach someone else how to do it. That is how it works. See one, do one, teach one. And the goal of this residency training is to acquire the ability to perform in the absence of the mentor. One day you will be the one in the operating room. You have to do it yourself. So the level of proficiency that is expected is very high. And by analogy, the level of proficiency expected in the training program of Jesus is also very high. The ability to perform in some ways in the absence of the mentor. In the Gospels, the mentor will not ever be entirely absent because there is that notion of a teaching function of the Holy Spirit. We have a chain of transmission that is even more profound here. I just would like to show two texts to illustrate. So here is from the prophet Isaiah in chapter 50, a text about the suffering servant who is God's revealer in the world, who will bring awareness of God into the world. And look what it says. The Lord God has given me a well-instructed tongue, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious. I did not turn backward. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. The suffering servant is a teacher in the world, but he's also a student. And the teacher of this student is God. So there is transmission from God to the suffering servant. The Lord God has given me a well-instructed tongue that I may know how to teach. That's what it says. And then in the Gospel of John we have a connection. This is from God to the revealer. This is from the revealer to the disciples. First, the claim of the closeness of this figure to God. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is in the Father's lap. Ho on aiston kolpon to patros, in the lap or the chest, he's very close to the Father, who has made him known. Someone very close to God is giving us knowledge of God. And then we have this about the disciple, about the beloved disciple. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining in his lap. Same term. The one who is in the lap of the Father. Here, he has influenced the beloved disciple who is in the lap of the revealer. So these are images of closeness and faithful transmission in this chain of transmission from God to humans. A couple of points in closing. The Holocaust witness. For the Holocaust witness, the problem is not to remember. Remembering isn't a problem. It's hard to forget. And sometimes it is so painful to remember that you can't even do it. So this is a person whom I count as a friend. I know her. And I'm very happy to have met her, who just published a book last year in Norway. Her name is Irene Levin. We did not speak about the Holocaust. She was born in Sweden to Jewish Norwegian parents who had fled to Sweden. And this is her childhood, that her parents remember something. And they remember it well. And they would rather not remember it. It's not a problem to remember. The problem is to talk about it. We did not talk about the Holocaust. Mother, I, and the Silence is the subtitle. It's an amazing book, and I look forward to discussing it with the author. I have been promised that we will do that. And then back to Primo Levi. Here, the one whose life came to a sudden end in ways that are disputed. He may have ended his life at his own hand. It's possible. So here again, something that is easy to remember, but it's not easy to believe necessarily. So the memory is clear, but sharing it, believing it, is a challenge. So prisoner 174517, that was the number tattooed on his arm, had a recurrent nightmare at Auschwitz. He dreamed that he had survived, returned home, and told his family about his experience. Yet nobody listened. That's another predicament. The memory is clear, the facts are clear, but how do you share it? How do you believe it? And here is an even more tragic one on testimony and belief. And I have this from Jonathan Safran Foer's recent book, We Are the Weather. And he has his own Holocaust memory, Jonathan Safran Foer. And so he tells the story of these two characters. This is Jan Karski, who was a Polish diplomat and later academic who taught in the US, who had seen the Holocaust, seen the extermination of the Jews firsthand in Poland, had visited and seen camps, who traveled to the US, and he met with Felix Frankfurter, a justice of the Supreme Court in the US and a highly respected person. And here we are reading in my own underlined copy of this book. After surviving a perilous journey, as could be imagined, Karski arrived in Washington, D.C. in June 1943. There he met with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, and we can skip the rest of Frankfurter, and so on. And he questions him to make sure that he's not making up stuff. What is the height of the wall that separates the ghetto from the rest of the city is one of the questions Frankfurter will ask him. Frankfurter paced the room in silence, then took his seat and said, "Mr. Karski, a man like me talking to a man like you must be totally frank. So I must say that I am unable to believe what you told me." When Karski's colleague pleaded with Frankfurter to accept Karski's testimony account, Frankfurter responded, "I didn't say that this young man is lying. I said I am unable to believe him. My mind, my heart, they are made in such a way that I cannot accept it." Was the testimony true? It was. Is the account, the personal account of the witness, is it believable? Is he a person of integrity who tells the story as it really is? Undoubtedly. But the problem of belief still is there, because the story is so unusual. It is uniquely unique. You can understand that someone might not want to believe it. So I didn't say that this young man is lying. I said I am unable to believe him. And we say, decades later, we wish you had believed him. You should have believed him. We fault you for not believing. We do. One final example, one of my absolute favorites. This is another Jewish historian, Otto Dov Kulka, who died this year. He died in January this year. And he was also a historian who wrote on the subject of what happened to the Jews in Germany, with a massive project interviewing and exploring the attitude of ordinary Germans to the Jews. So he has written a book by the rules of history. And then he has written a testimony. It was published late in life. He also was someone who remembered but didn't want to say anything. It was just too painful what you do. But then someone talked him into a tape recorder, and here is the tape recording, and you can see that there is a certain brokenness to it. But I think Otto Dov Kulka's book, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death, is testimony similar to the testimony of the beloved disciple. There is one exception. I think the testimony of the beloved disciple is a testimony that has been told over and over and over. There was never a period of silence. So that's a different. But it's a testimony that matures. This is someone's mature testimony. And so let's read what he says here. He is a little bit shy about sharing his testimony, but few are aware of the existence within me of a dimension of silence, of a choice I made to sever the biographical from the historical past. The hidden meaning of the metaphoric language of the central recurrent motifs in the book, the sort of terms he uses, such as immutable law of the death, such as the Great Death, such as the metropolis of death at Auschwitz, reaches beyond the experience of the world of Auschwitz. They are metaphors for what at the time seemed to expand into a world order that would change the course of human history and remain so in my reflective memory. I am also aware that these texts, though anchored in concrete historical events, transcend the sphere of history. So what do you have here? You have at the core a memory of someone who was 10 years old at Auschwitz, and who that memory plays in his mind. He loses his mother, and eventually will go to the place where the mother died at Stutthof after they were separated. And so there is at the core concrete, real memories, faithfully shared with us. But in addition to memory, there is reflection, which is a value-added memory, the memory with value added to it. First, the memory itself, and then someone's reflection on that memory. I think that's exactly what you have in the fourth gospel. You have a real memory, and you have mature reflection, value added to the memory. And now for our summary. Mentor and disciple, memory and manuscript. Testimony is a valid and priceless form of historiography. Don't disparage it. And we don't think we can afford that with the testimonies of the Holocaust. For events that are uniquely unique, a person's testimony may not only be our best source, but also our only source. Jesus selected trainees with great care. The Gospels are an intentional and not an accidental fruit of the training program. Some experiences are easy to remember and impossible to forget. I would say the memories, the uniquely unique memories we have in the Gospels, are also in that category. Experiences that are uniquely unique, since they are so different, confront the obstacle of disbelief. Frankfurter says to Jan Karski, I don't say that he is lying, I just can't believe it. That's, and there are many stories of even in our context in Scandinavia, when news came from England what was happening to the Jews, it wasn't believed. And here's the final point. In John, on my reading, the testimony was believed. We know that his testimony is true.